I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And I'm really delighted that we are partnering with our Global Energy Center and our Global Business and Economics Center for this very timely event. As you all know, on May the 8th, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and announced that all the sanctions that had been lifted in 2016 would be reimposed. Administration officials had been traveling the globe, talking in particular about oil and telling the various importers of Iranian oil that they have until November the 4th to stop all their purchases, to go to zero in their purchases of Iranian oil or face U.S. secondary sanctions. So we have a lot of questions about how successful this new effort will be, what the impact will be on the oil markets, on Iran, and we have a really great panel. Amos Hochstein will be joining us hopefully very shortly. He is with Tellurian Inc., but he played a key role in Iran sanctions under the Obama administration as U.S. Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs and the head of the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. We also have Brian O'Toole, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economics program, but prior to that, he was a senior advisor to the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the infamous OFAC, at the U.S. Treasury Department, and very, very involved with the Iran sanctions program. Then we have a dear friend of the council, Sarah Vakshuri, who's the founder and president of SVB Energy International, which is a strategic energy consulting firm, and she has extensive experience in global energy markets, including working in Iran for the National Iranian Oil Company International. Then we're also very lucky to have Anna Borshevskaya, who used to be at the Atlantic Council. We unfortunately lost her to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and she's an expert on Russia and the Middle East. And then finally, joining us from the United Arab Emirates via Skype is Robin Mills, who is Chief Executive Officer of Kamar Energy. He also worked for Shell, concentrating on new business in the Middle East, and for Dubai Holding and the Emirates National Oil Company. He has a lot of expertise when it comes to Middle East oil. So while we wait for Amos, I think we're going to start with Brian. We all know that the sanctions that were put in effect in 2012 in particular had quite a drastic effect on Iranian oil exports and were certainly a factor in bringing Iran to negotiations and into reaching the JCPOA. Now we have a situation where the United States has left while Iran was implementing the deal. So I think there are real questions about how effective this sanctions redux policy is going to be. I wonder if you could just make a few comments from your perspective.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming. It's a good turnout, and thank you to Barbara for putting on this great event. I think just to set the stage a little bit with some overarching thoughts, what we had in 2013, 2012, as everybody I think remembers, is it was a ramp up of sanctions globally, right? It wasn't just within the United States. There were a series of United Nations Security Council resolutions that targeted a whole kind of slew of Iranian bad behavior, including ballistic missiles and all sorts of other things. The nuclear proliferation was the primary underlier for those sanctions regimes. That's a very different situation than we have today, and I think that's basically kind of where everybody needs to start from, right? The Trump administration clearly thinks that it can just run back its playbook of maximum pressure on North Korea is going to get the Iranian regime to the table. And that's, I think, where this argument starts to fall apart a little bit for Iran, and where you have to question what the goals really are with this policy, right? The globe was behind us. The world was behind us in 2013. That led to the JCPOA. The rest of the world is not with us right now. And so as a fundamental matter, the sanctions that the Trump administration wants to impose, this kind of maximum pressure, greater than they were in 2013, is going to be incredibly difficult for them to achieve. Europe has a great deal of consternation with the U.S. withdrawal, although I do think that Europe will probably come along with U.S. sanctions to a large degree. The bigger outliers here are going to be Turkey, Iran, or Turkey, Russia, China, and India, who are some of the biggest oil importers from Iran. And the problem that you run into there, right, is if you can get to, right, I think, the estimates that I've been giving, and Barbara and I have spoken about this, so that the Trump administration is going to get to maybe 85, 90% of the effectiveness of 2013. The problem, though, is that last 10% is really critically important, right? That might be the difference between the Iranian regime saying, we can deal with this situation as is, and we don't have to come back to a negotiating table, and them actually coming back to the negotiating table. And that 10% is the hardest 10% to get. That's where you need the globe behind you to get there. And so the suggestion that we're going to get to this maximum pressure, this kind of greater than 2013 status, either is kind of a fantasy or it implies that there are going to be other sanctions on Iran. And the problem is, if you get beyond the oil, there isn't a lot you can do externally. There are things you can do to kind of peel around the edges and get into Iran's pocketbook to some degree, but it's not going to have the effect that the oil has. And then very specifically, I think on the oil sanctions themselves, right? NDAA 1245 is kind of the primary oil sanction that comes back into effect on November 6th. It's the one that has the significantly reducing kind of provision in it for an exception. The Trump administration has stated that they want everybody to go to zero. They've walked that back a little bit, but I think the biggest thing that I would look for, and what I've kind of counseled folks before on this as well, is if there's a deal to be had, it's not going to be in exporting cars to Iran, right? If there's a deal to be had that allows some countries, whether that's Europe, our allies, and Korea and Japan, whether it allows China, Russia, India, Turkey to keep some level of imports, I think the deal's to be had on oil, and it's for this reason. In NDAA 1245, the setup is you can exempt a country from basically sanctions on the central bank of Iran if they're significantly reducing oil. And what that does is it allows you to park the money for those oil exports in that foreign country. And that money can only be used for approved bilateral trade, right? So that takes that money away from Iran. And if you think about the way that I think this administration is and probably should be thinking about this, right? Their chief complaint that I think rings truest is Iran has used money that it has gotten from the JCPOA to cause havoc in the region. Or, if you don't want to suppose that, you can say Iran hasn't slowed its ability or its causing of havoc in the region because of the JCPOA. And so if you're really trying to go after Iran and tamp down on that behavior, you want to take away as much money as possible. And I actually think allowing people to continue importing oil, allowing foreign countries, whether that's in Europe or otherwise, you want that money tied up in a jurisdiction like Japan or Korea, where you have better control over that money, rather than giving the Iranians a chance to try to smuggle it out, which, they're going to take a haircut on that. So say they get 50% of the revenue, but that's 50% of the revenue in cash, rather than 50% of the revenue sitting parked in the Bank of Japan, right? So I think that's where you could see a deal happening. And so I think, the administration may say going to zero as a negotiating start, but I really don't think that's where they're going to end up, because it is in their interests, I think, to pursue some sort of negotiated deal on the Iranian oil.
Okay, thanks. Amos, I've already introduced you, and I'm glad you arrived, because I think I want to follow on that with this whole notion of waivers. The administration took a very hard line a couple weeks ago, go to zero. And then now, first on background, and then on the record, we've seen administration officials, most recently the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, say, well, on a case-by-case basis, we may reach some accommodation. Is that for the reasons that Brian suggested, that they want to lock up Iran's oil revenues in foreign banks, or because they saw what was happening with the price of oil and they worried about the domestic implications of rising gasoline prices?
Well, first, thank you for having me. My apologies for being late. You have to separate it out into a few different pieces. One, I don't think we should listen too much to, beyond the game of reading tea leaves. They themselves don't know if they're going to be waivers or not. So I don't think they've made a decision one way or the other. They are only having their first team from Treasury and stayed over in India today. That's the first visit. So you can't really make decisions what I'm going to do on waivers, exemptions, et cetera, until you actually talk to some people. So I think we have to take a deep breath here that this is rolling out a little bit slower than the aggressive rollout rhetorically. Now you get to the point of actually having to implement it, and that's an entirely different operation. They're operating relatively with it in a much more convenient environment than the Obama administration had to operate in early 2012. When you're operating at a $70 versus 110, 105, it's a much, much different environment. They can actually afford to do more without affecting the market too much. We also have to separate out between what's really going to affect the market versus the rhetoric that affects the market. Talking up and down the price of oil happens because traders are sometimes as impatient, breathless, and hyperventilate as much as people in Washington do. So they're not a very different breed. So you get a headline and everybody goes and oil prices go up.
Bank of America said $120 a barrel the other week. So
the same banks who told us in June of 2014 that the new floor for oil prices was $100, and 6 months later we were at 28. So I would just be patient a little bit with everybody's assessments on this. So they're operating in a relatively comfortable environment from a market perspective. There's plenty of oil on the market at the moment, and there's more sources of oil. We do have some constraints. We have Venezuela, but let's not exaggerate that piece, because there's also more oil that can be put onto the market in the short term. So we have to divide the questions into, I think, a number of questions. Number one is, when you talk about going to zero or not, it's not a global number. So when you talk about percentages or numbers, it's not a global number. Europe is going to zero. And that has nothing to do with waivers and exemptions, because no bank will allow a European company to trade in oil whether they get an exemption or not. So it's not even a question. European governments have made a public announcement that they, in a sense, right, through actions, they will not support European companies in their sanctions issues with the United States. You're on your own, which means that every board of directors says, I'm not doing this. Every bank says, even if the Americans had faked that they're going to let us do it, or say that they're going to let us do it, they could just as easily 2 months later say they're not, and I don't want to be stuck, I'm not doing it. So Europe's 500,000 or so barrels go off the market regardless of what happens in Washington. That's already almost completely done. So almost every single European buyer has already made that decision. Iran already knows it, because some of the production adjustments that you've seen in Iran are already responding to the European cutoff, which always happens first. The NDAA, when it passed in December, the end of December of 11, with an implementation date of July of 2012, the Europeans were at zero long before that deadline happened. They were the first to go, because they have to deal with that. The second piece, now you start talking about individual countries that are the main buyers. So don't look at the small numbers, look at where volume is. And that's essentially, it's India, Japan, Korea, China, and Turkey. Everybody else is smaller volumes that are going to be drags here or there. So now you have to look at it as each individual country. Japan and Korea will operate based on what the United States, if the United States says go to zero, they will go to zero, and there is oil in the market for them to be able to do that. And their payment structure with Iran is not dissimilar to the rest of the market, and therefore they don't actually lose any money by doing that. It's just a lot less convenient, and it puts them at a risk of overexposure to a smaller number of suppliers. India does not believe in, structurally and formally does not support sanctions. And therefore, they always have an issue with asking for exemptions, because you can't ask for an exemption from because that de facto acquiesces that you have accepted the concept of sanctions. So there are a variety of ways to do that, but India actually is in a more precarious situation, because they pay the Iranians some of it in euros, some of it in rupees. When you translate rupees and buy from others in dollars, you just paid a premium on your oil price, or they actually get punished by this. So if somebody should get an exemption, at the end of the day, it would be taking into account the state that India would have to face. Now you're left with China and Turkey. Turkey, that's anybody's bet. I'm not going to go there. And China has a trade dispute in the United States, and we've now put another financial issue on the table there's no reason to believe that the Chinese won't put this as part of a broader set of negotiations. This will not be negotiated with the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy. It's going to be at a much higher level at the trade negotiations of, here's what you want me to do, well, here's what I want out of this, and it'll have to be worked out there. China has never been a supporter of international sanctions on any country for its own reasons, and even when they complied with the sanctions under NDAA during the negotiations, they never said they were. They were diversifying their resources around the world, and they would put it in a newspaper that they were diversifying, and that's how they did what we asked. But it's important to note one major difference between 2012 to 15 versus now. There was a process. So most of these countries, or at least some of them, were part of the P5+1. China was sitting inside the negotiating room. They knew the effects of the sanctions, and they knew what it was doing in the negotiations, and they knew that there was an end date for these sanctions. Either the talks were going to fail, and the sanctions would stay for longer and maybe strengthen, or the talks would succeed and the sanctions would go away. The question that many around the world are asking now privately is saying, okay, but when does this end? So let's go back to one last thing that I said earlier, which is that some in the oil markets would, including my friend here, may attack, would tell me that I'm crazy, that there's enough oil in the market. In the short term, there is. But the short term is not the long term, and we have to look at, are these sanctions without a process of negotiations? Are we talking about a year? Because 6 months from November on, I don't see any reason why the market can't handle that kind of a reduction. If you're looking at longer than that, even with potentially lower demand numbers for oil, you're still growing at north of 1 million barrels a day of demand. So, so outside of Washington, we talk about peak oil or never a peak. In the real world, we're still growing oil demand at a pretty healthy pace, whether when we talk about slowdown, it's only relative to the last 2 years that were very healthy. So 1.7, 1.8, 1.5 million barrels a day. But at these levels, you now have to start saying, okay, Saudi, Russia, Kuwait, UAE, and a little bit out of the United States, you can supply the market. But what happens a year from today if we're in the same place? Now you have to factor in all that they've contributed and keeping it there at a sustained basis while also addressing global demand. The US is the wild card. It can add more oil by production, but people forget, we have a constraint in infrastructure. We can add a lot more oil to the market at these prices, but we don't have pipelines to take them from the points of production in the US to the point of export. We have a congestion. That has nothing to do with the global markets. That's because we've had a major turnaround in our own fortunes in oil, and our pipelines are too few and built in the wrong direction. So we've already spent $60 billion on pipelines to redirect them, but we need a lot more. And that will also take time. It requires regulatory approvals for new pipelines. It requires additional infrastructure to come on. So again, I try to separate this out into not giving one sort of headline, where are we going to be? And I'll end with saying that the biggest question is going to be beyond India is if China stays at the levels that are even just a few 100,000, what we've seen is Iran can stay for quite a long time. Its economy can sustain that kind of exports. And forget this will be the real last word, oil is fungible. It's very easy to cheat on oil. We've had the Saddam era oil for food violations, and even during a remarkable interagency process between the intelligence community, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Energy Department, and everyone else, we knew that we were not catching everything. And I can tell you today the stuff that they can still do. And they can still blend Iranian oil into the market, not at huge numbers. But remember, it doesn't take much to sustain a economy of resistance, that they like to coin the phrase, to be able to keep them going. And that translates back into the question of timing. How long will these sanctions be in place?
And if the price goes up, they have to sell less. Actually, let me go to you next, Sarah, because this is a perfect intro into what you have to say. Iran has seen this movie before. They certainly knew and have known for over a year and a half that it was coming, pretty much, because of the comments that President Trump has made about the Iran deal. Are they ready for this, and have they figured out how they are going to continue to sell energy or to get more for the energy that they do sell?
Well, as you said, I mean, since the Islamic Revolution, there has been many different sanctions, and so they are masters of blending oil, as you said. But first, I like to mention a few issues that Amos talk kind of like continue that. One is the expiration day. I remember this was something that we would discuss previously, that for how long we could push this alliance against Iran, and now is that for how long the market can go without Iranian oil. So that expiration date is very important, and as Amos mentioned, now I would see this as actually a problem of starting from low oil prices, because people are used to low oil prices and they would panic harder to go to higher prices. And using kind of 70% of a spare capacity, whatever Saudi Arabia can produce, whatever Russia or like OPEC can produce to cover Iranian oil, might be doable for short term, but it creates a psychological impact in the market that could increase the prices a bit. And Iranian are kind of trying to use in their rhetoric when they say we don't let any drop of oil to be exported, not maybe literally at this point, but to remind the market that, okay, if you're using all the spare capacity to cover for us, what would be happen in the event of crisis? So the U.S. can use the strategic reserves, but for how many days? I mean, we can go by end of next year, mid next year, but what is the goal and for how long we would need to continue this and how much we could continue? But something that is interesting is Saudi Arabia factor, which during the previous sanctions, Europe was kind of a backbone of the sanctions that helped the effectiveness of the sanctions by putting embargo on Iran and also the sanctions on insurance. But now we could say that Saudi Arabia is really helpful for effectiveness of sanctions. Well, in convincing the countries, if you look at it, if previously there was a political alliance against Iran and its nuclear agreement, now we could say that there's kind of a business or trade agreement against Iran. Everybody would look how much they would gain, how much they would lose. Saudi Arabia's investment in Russia, Saudi Arabia's investment in India, their Total's investment in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco's Total's investment in India. So it turns into kind of a what political, aside from political or reputation issues, about business. What do they lose? What do they gain? In fact, we think that higher effectiveness of the sanctions, not because President Trump and his administration are very effective in implementing the sanctions, but for different factors. Amos already described the European Union, that we think by September we would see even more a reduction, as you mentioned, from January 2012, before even July, Iranian production was already dropped by 1 million barrels per day. And we're expecting by August that the first sets of sanctions are going to go into effect. In September, we're going to see much more lower export. And Iran lost some market share in Asia. Its market share was more, gained a bit in Europe. So it's going to lose that. Then we have Japan and South Korea, that the previous experience, especially among Japanese, the previous experience of sanctions, they don't really want to deal with that headache. But we have China, so we would have a scenario that China and President Trump would reach to a deal that, okay, we reduce the tariffs, or we give you some waivers on the tariffs, you reduce some imports from Iran, maybe China imports 200, 400, maybe not. China imports 500 or 600, but that would be not much. It's not the whole world. We would have Russia, and they announced that they're going to have some imports. This is part of that 150,000 barrels per day of food for oil for goods agreement. And even if we have India importing, 2017, India at some point reduced its import to 100 because of conflicts that they had with Iran over Farzad B and some of the other energy projects. So totally, we might have export of 400 to 700, which is way lower than what Iran was exporting during the nuclear sanctions of 1.5. On condensate too, no? Amos doesn't agree with that, but this is even lower. So if things go this way that they're going, Iran could have on this scenario lower. Now, are they ready for that or not? Iran is also exporting petrochemical and refined petroleum products.
And electricity.
and electricity. That was part of the economy resistance. They're going to produce more of that. They can, this is, I quote Iranian media, that they could transfer oil to neighboring through their share fields. They can, the other country on the other side could produce, give some commission and export it. But I would like to ask this from Amos using his previous experience. Blending and cheating wouldn't go more than 150,000 barrels per day. I mean, how much do you think they could add? I mean, this cheating or blending, how much would add to their export in reality?
I don't want to become a spokesman or an advisor to the Iranian.
No, I'm not saying I'm not. But I'm saying that because it's not a huge number.
It's not a huge 200.
Exactly. So that 150, 200, I just wanted to just bring that number is because everybody say cheating, they are going to cheat. But that cheating is not 1 million barrels. It's not 400, 500. It's 150 to 200. It creates income. It's good for the crisis. It helps the country. But that 150 or 200 is not a significant amount. Yes, if Iran's export reduces to 700, that 200 is significant. But it's 1 million or it's not that significant amount. And previous experience shows that the process is so complex that there's lots of corruption involved, and Iran doesn't get exactly like 200 multiple barrels per day. Something interesting has happened is that during the past 2 years, because of the government and President Rouhani's administration, they cracked on, because of corruption, on many of these Revolutionary Guard people or people that they were doing all this blending and cheating because of their corruption. Now most of those people's names are blown out. They're in jails or they cannot function. So it's a question because Iranian officials said that anyone in a private market can come and buy oil versus the refiners, which was traditionally, but not people in the street can buy oil and sell it. And these people with logistical experiences, now they're kind of stuck somewhere and their names are blown out, their networks are blown out. So I don't know that like how much that cheating could be effective, but of course at the time of hard economy would be helpful.
Okay, let me stop you there. Let me turn to Anna and talk about Russia's role. Of course, Russia is much in the news these days, and we've seen that the JCPOA actually was mentioned, if you may remember, at the Helsinki summit, and President Putin said some nice things about it. I'm not sure that President Trump agreed with that particular aspect. Can Russia actually be of use? I mean, Russia is obviously benefiting from higher oil prices and so on. It's a competitor to Iran. It's part of an OPEC agreement that was very favorable to it. But we have seen reports that, Russia, trade between Iran and Russia has increased by 36% in the first 4 months of 2018. Russian oil company recently signed a $4 billion contract with Iran's Ministry of Oil. There's talk about a Gazprom deal, investment of 50 billions in gas, and so on and so forth. So what can Russia really do, and what are Russia's priorities with regard to Iran in this environment?
Sure, thank you very much, Barbara, and it's great to be here. Let me start by a comment that Putin made in Helsinki that I don't think received as much attention as many of his other comments, as well as Trump's. One of the things Putin said is that and I quote, he said, "We can work together on regulation of plummeting oil prices." And he said something to the effect of how oil basically can be one area of cooperation with Russia. To evaluate this statement, I think it's important first to remember that for the Kremlin, energy has always been a foreign policy tool. And it's particularly noteworthy that Putin made this comment in Helsinki at this type of event, which shows the importance that he places on energy issues. When it comes to Iran and Russia's relations with Iran, there are a number of issues, but I think one of the key points that I want to make is that the Russia-Iran relationship has really been unprecedented in basically in the grand scope of 500 years, a very complicated relationship between these two countries. And it's not by accident. Putin wanted to bring Russia back to the Middle East from the very beginning, and he's worked steadily towards that goal since he came to power in 2000. There are a number of reasons why Putin cares about Iran, but the priority is common foreign policy objectives, and that is curbing Western influence in the Middle East. And that interest was there before, and it will remain there in the foreseeable future. In terms of Russia's economic relations with Iran, that has always been a secondary to its burgeoning political relationship, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. And as Barbara, as you mentioned, there's growth, substantial growth in this area. And Russia always had, in particular, an interest in Iran's energy sector as well. I think, frankly, here Russia is taking a long-term view because I think it realizes that that this is a long-term, that there's lots of obstacles they're going to have to overcome on both sides, but they're clearly committed to overcoming them, and they're doing it incrementally. More recently, we've seen a number of developments, specifically on Russia-Iran relations on oil. In addition to what you've mentioned, Barbara, Russia's state-owned energy company, Zarubezh Neft, in March signed an oil field development deal with the National Iranian Oil Company. It's a $742 million deal, and reportedly it may bring as much as $4 billion into Iran. In April, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev signed an interim agreement to set up a free trade area between Iran and the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union. And in May, Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif came to Moscow to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. One of the most important takeaways of that meeting is that he affirmed that they will intend to continue economic cooperation despite sanctions. There's certainly the oil for goods deal that's been in the works for a while. This is a years-long endeavor. It's unclear where it's going, but it's still in discussion. So this is not going to change, I think, in terms of the Russia-Iran dynamic. But I also think, having made these points, I just want to take a step back and look at what Russia is doing regionally as well on this issue. If you look at the OPEC deal of last month, what we see here is quite important because Russia's role in OPEC is growing. Specifically when Russia and Saudi Arabia made this deal to increase oil production. And some have made the argument that this can be helpful in the United States because it's eager to keep oil prices stable. But what's crucial here is that Russia is de facto institutionalizing its role within the OPEC. And this also allows Russia to have a growing influence over Saudi Arabia. More broadly, frankly, this deal also shows that Russia's sway in the entire region, including with adversaries, is also in the upswing. And again, this is not a new thing at all. This is just the latest iteration of this trajectory. And I think I'll just conclude there in the interest of saving time with just one last point. What we see is a consistent approach that Russia has taken, that Putin has taken in the Middle East, which is being able to talk to everybody, including particularly on this issue, but also on a whole host of other issues. And that's going to be the theme of Russia in the near future in this region.
Great. Robin, you've been very patient. Can you hear? Have you heard the whole discussion?
Yes, fine. Thanks, everyone.
Good. Well, we are waiting now to hear your thoughts on what you've heard. Tell us what you agree with. Tell us what you disagree with. How do you think the regional energy picture is going to change as a result of the reimposition of these sanctions? And how is Iran going to cope? Is it going to work through Iraq, perhaps? Looking forward to your comments. So, the floor is yours.
Sure, and I think I'll kick off with thinking about the response of the other regional countries. Now, it's a very complex picture, and I think we've heard that outlined by the rest of the panel as they've each tackled their various players involved in this. There's a lot of moving parts here, and they go well beyond the oil market, and they go well beyond Iran, and there's it's obviously there's wider political issues at stake here as well that get dragged in. If we think specifically about the oil market, I think we think about the regional countries. The key tool that they have to play in all this is their oil production and their control of oil exports, and a lot of that, of course, exerted through OPEC and through the OPEC Plus deal with Russia, and that has made them key players in this how these Iran sanctions have played out so far. Now, I think it's well known, it's no secret that a couple of the regional countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE particularly, have been strongly encouraging the reimposition of sanctions on Iran. They were not pleased with the JCPOA. They've been happy to see the US abandoning it. And having pushed strongly for that diplomatically, of course, they're called upon to do their bit. And you've obviously seen this through Donald Trump's tweets attacking OPEC for high prices. And the response of the regional countries in trying to do their bit to reduce them. Now, if you look at the OPEC meeting that just passed in mid-June, this was called, the OPEC meeting was intended to see what would happen with the OPEC Plus deal, along with Russia and Oman and some other countries. Russia really, of course, the key one. And the question was, well, the oil market is getting tighter here because of our deal. The deal has achieved success in our terms. Prices have gone up. The market's potentially getting over tight. And there were several concerns at that meeting already, but the two key ones were the drop in production in Venezuela, which has become a precipitous decline, and the prospect of sanctions being reimposed on Iran and therefore taking oil off the market later in this year. And I think really the Iranians at this meeting were outmaneuvered. They came away with an agreement that they thought was about the best they could hope for on paper. But it turned out, I think, in reality that they'd been a little behind the scenes been outmaneuvered. Because when the export figures for June came out, there was a major ramp up in OPEC exports by Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, and also by some other countries. Now, how did they manage to ramp up their exports so much in June when the meeting only happened in the middle of June? I mean, the obvious conclusion of that is they'd already started ramping up their exports from the beginning of the month. The deal that was reached in Vienna with the OPEC meeting was a fait accompli. OPEC, the OPEC kind of core around Saudi Arabia always intended that they would enforce what they kind of term as full compliance. So instead of over-compliance, with countries overall cutting more than they pledged to under the deal, largely because of the collapse of Venezuela, the agreement was, well, they would cut back to only being at 100% compliance. Now, the Iranians interpreted that to mean that countries that could increase production up to their target would do so, and the others would do the best they could. But the Saudis and the UAE and the others interpreted it differently, in that their view was, well, OPEC as a whole will try to not over-comply, and therefore that means if Venezuela is 600,000 to 700,000 under its target, then the Saudis and UAE and anybody else is able to take that share from them. And that's indeed exactly what's happened. OPEC exports in June are up something like 1.4 million barrels per day. A huge return of oil to the market. Iran so far hasn't lost much, possibly lost a little bit, as some buyers have started preemptively reducing purchases. Hasn't lost much yet, although it's likely to lose more later in the year. Venezuela, as we know, of course, has lost a lot and probably will continue to lose production. But anyway, the other OPEC countries around Saudi Arabia have greatly increased production. And obviously their intention here is to reduce prices, or keep prices kind of cool in the $70 kind of dollar range, rather than breaking out towards 90 or 100 and really putting a lot more political pressure on. Because if oil prices go too high, I think two things happen. Firstly, the Trump administration will come under pressure domestically, and I know, I'm sure as you've all seen, the Democrats already testing out using high gasoline prices as a attack line against the administration. And of course, it then becomes an obvious charge that by blowing up the JCPOA that the Trump administration has brought this on itself. And the other angle, of course, is the higher prices go, the more incentive people have to evade sanctions. There's more financial incentive, and of course countries get desperate and are maybe willing to take chances that they wouldn't take if conditions were more moderate, and Amos alluded to this earlier. So it's important for the success of this strategy to keep prices moderate. And that's kind of fine up until the end of this year. But I think we also need to think about the long view of this. I don't think, barring some really unexpected events or a major escalation of this crisis, that anybody expects these sanctions to bring Iran to the negotiating table quickly, if at all, or to bring a collapse of the regime quickly, if at all. We go back to the case of Iraq. Iraq, of course, was under very strict oil sanctions for 13 years following the first Gulf War, and did not collapse. And Iran is in a rather better position than Iraq was then. And so we really think, well, what is the long game here? And so far, we've seen short-term actions, I think, on the oil market, this increase in production. And on the US side, talk about using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, releasing some oil from that. We've not seen, as far as I'm aware, any long-term strategy for what if these sanctions on Iran go on for 3, 4, 5 years, and Iran is still managing to export a certain amount and keep itself going, and is not under such pressure that it has to negotiate, or the regime is in serious danger. The obvious conclusion then, I think, is that other major oil countries will have to step up and increase production capacity. Now, some have some plans in the works, which have had it in the works for a long time and unconnected to Iran. The UAE is increasing output somewhat over the next few years. Kuwait has plans, which it never really manages to execute. Iraq has plans to increase, and Iraq has increased production a lot. Iraq, again, is not doing that to be hostile to Iran. I mean, quite the reverse, but Iraq is doing that for its own interests. But Iraq has many issues, and we know there's serious protests going on in Iraq at the moment that just point to the difficulties the Iraqi government has achieving its national development targets. So Iraq will put more oil on the market over the next few years, undoubtedly, but again, probably not enough to compensate for complete loss of Iran. And the Saudis, the obvious ones that could increase capacity, they have certainly undeveloped fields, they have projects ready to go that over a 3 to 4 year period could bring extra capacity, but no real sign that they're actually launching those at the moment. I guess that, the one kind of tangible sign we have there is some talk over restarting the neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. It's been shut down over a political dispute, dressed up as an environmental dispute. 500,000 barrels a day of capacity. There's talk of bringing that back maybe at the start of next year. But in terms of long-term capacity increases by Saudi, no real talk yet. And the Saudi spare capacity, of course, most OPEC and most global spare capacity is in Saudi Arabia. 2.5 million barrels per day on official figures. And a large part of that will have to be deployed and is already being deployed if this Saudi strategy of increasing production and trying to keep prices reasonable is going to succeed. And the one other concern I think I want to draw attention to, Amos says that oil is fungible, and of course he's right in a global sense, but we really do need to bear in mind oil quality. The oil market over the past few years has been oversupplied because of US crude, and US crude, I see it has just passed 11 million barrels per day at an all-time high. But of course the shale oil the US produces is typically very light crude. It'll be an ideal replacement for Iranian condensate, but it is not a good replacement for Iranian medium and heavy crudes. The other oil that we've lost off the market, Venezuela, also medium and heavy crudes. These crudes are producing heavy fuel oil, they're producing diesel, they're producing jet kerosene. And that is really where we could see a tightening in the market for those grades of fuel, where no matter how much shale oil you put through a refinery, you simply can't get more than a certain yield of the heavy products out. And we could see tightening in that market, and there's only the Gulf Arab countries that have the spare capacity in those grades to fill that gap in the market. And one interesting wild card on that, which I think is worth mentioning, just again illustrating how many moving parts there are with this, is that at the start of 2020, the International Maritime Organization is introducing new rules on marine fuel that will pretty much require ship owners to stop burning heavy fuel oil, which is very polluting, and burn. They will probably have a large part of it. They'll have to burn marine diesel instead. This is really going to tighten the diesel markets. This is going to put even more stress on those kind of medium gravity crudes that produce diesel. And of course, I'm sure you're also all politically aware of what's going to happen at the end of 2020. So that's an important year for several reasons. If we're going to have an oil price squeeze at that point.
Okay.
So I think that's.
Fred, let me stop you there. I want to ask one more question to both Brian and Amos about about just process and how things work in Washington. We were talking about this a little bit before the event. We have an administration that is not terribly well coordinated, I guess would be a charitable way to describe it. Is there the capacity within the Trump administration, in your view, to not only go around the world and urge various countries not to buy Iranian oil, but to actually follow through on enforcement of sanctions if, let's say, the price of oil remains at $70 a barrel, goes above, and there is incentive for a good bit of cheating and evasion and various other tactics. So who will actually be responsible for going out and doing something about this and imposing the sanctions? How will it all work? So whichever one of you wants to take a stab at that first. Is it the State Department or Treasury, or how does it work?
Coordination between the two.
I would hate to suggest that there was completely well-oiled machine of organization and coordination and in the Obama years. So let's not say it's bad now. It was amazing before. This was, the textbook for cooperation. We have different agencies that have different ways of doing things. From time immemorial, there will always be conflict and some requirement at the top levels to grease some wheels when feelings are hurt, and just ways of doing things. But at the end of the day, my basic answer to you is yes. Do they have the ability to do it? Of course. You have to divorce the messiness in the press and at the top with the fact that there are still, in the offices that we've worked with, for and with in the past, there are still very capable and competent people who have actually done this before, and not so long ago. And several of those people are still around and they know what to do. The issue will be more when they start to implement, will be two levels. One is, what is the policy? I think that's going to be the tough part. And the second piece will be on the implementation side. There'll be different moments of implementation. If you have sanctions, yeah, they know how to do it. But what's going to be the appetite at any given moment to sanction any given entity? Remember, sometimes you say, I'm going to sanction anybody. And then the first package comes and you're like, well, not that. That's going to cause me a headache. Because that happens to be a company from a country or related to or has a relationship with the leadership of a certain country. I have other things going on. So there are a lot of considerations. If you don't see a sanction, it's not always because they don't know how or they can't, but there are complications. Mm-hmm. I'll let you sort of give the Treasury perspective. I think it's going to be a cooperation here. The State Department's going to probably take the lead on the analysis, the way it was done before, on the analysis of the oil market, the negotiation with specific oil companies and refineries and governments to figure out how do we do this and follow up. Treasury will look at the expertise that they have with the financial systems and financial banks and institutions. And these sanctions are essentially a tapestry of those two issues of, oil and diplomatic interest to do something, and then people who actually have the knowledge inside the depths of the financial institutions to see what is happening, what's not happening, and how can you tighten. But there's a third leg of it, which is the international community, and that is the private sector. The financial institutions are far more conservative than anything the Trump administration will do. So as hardcore as they want to go, the financial institutions will be to the right of them.
Yeah. Before you add to that, Brian, there have been reports that the European Union is going to authorize various central banks in Europe to be in charge of whatever kind of trade, whatever kind of financing is necessary with the Iranian central bank. You're shaking your head. You don't think those central banks will touch any of this? We're not talking about private entities.
I think Europe as a whole is too dollarized and too reliant on the dollar to really get away with trying to test the limits of U.S. sanctions. The dollar is so prevalent in international transactions, it's almost hard to overstate. Even if it's only 40-50% of international trade, the oil market in particular is priced in dollars. So the second you get away from that, you're talking about taking on increased risk in the forward markets and all of the kind of associated costs that come with that. And then, I think I almost kind of hinted at it in what he was talking about. If you're the Indians and you're in rupees, you can't get out of rupees into the euro without going through dollars. So how are you going to buy this stuff without going through the dollar market? And that's extremely difficult for them, right? So it may not be the kind of denomination that they want to trade in, but they still can't get to a denomination they want to trade in without going through the dollar first. And that's kind of one of the hidden costs here, the hidden kind of hands. I mean, in terms of the process within the government, I couldn't agree more with Amos. I think, yes, the capacity is there. Enforcing this stuff is easy, frankly. I mean, for the most part. It's the intelligence agencies who collect the information on who's doing what. The State Department has a role in that as well with the embassies overseas and just kind of the day-to-day diplomatic reporting. But in large part, you're talking about civil servants. From the OFAC side, OFAC is entirely civil service from the director on down, and so they're all still there. Many of them were there ramping up sanctions, ramping them back down, and now they're ramping them back up again. I think the question, and almost hit it right on the head, is the policy of this, right? When you start getting into the kind of details of, okay, we're going to take action, what does that mean? Or we're not going to take action, what does that mean? That's when kind of the decisions rise up to a senior level, and that's within this administration, as I understand it, where there's kind of the most dysfunction. There are not the same number of principals and deputies meetings that there were in the last administration. Not saying that the number we had under Obama was appropriate, or way too many of them. But not having them means you're basically subject to, Trump changing his mind on something or not liking the optics.
Right.
And the JCPOA itself is the best example. There were a whole bunch of really good reasons to stay in. All of the sanctions that they released in the immediate aftermath of withdrawal from the JCPOA, you may remember Treasury released sanctions on Iran for, I think 2 weeks afterwards on almost an every other day basis. All of those sanctions were sanctions that would have still been fair game under the JCPOA, right? So it wasn't as if they couldn't have gone after that, and it wasn't as if they couldn't have gotten the Euros to get on board with going after ballistic missiles, the instability in Yemen and the instability in Syria. It was that Trump wanted to get out of the JCPOA, and so that's always going to be the hang up here, is what optically appeals to him, and does that conflict with what the rest of his government wants to do? And I think that's where there's a real kind of danger of having a very kind of variable
and we've
effect.
seen things like ZTE and so on where, one day
ZTE
they're
is
sanctioned
inexplicable in a lot of
one
ways.
day they're not sanctioned, and so it could become part of, I think the point made about trade-offs with other issues regarding trade with Europe, China could get involved in that. Let me open up to our very large and interesting audience here. If you have a question, raise your hand, say your name, say to whom the question is directed, and please make it a question. I see a gentleman right there in the middle. Wait for the mic. Yeah, you. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Mark Meyerowitz, SUNY Maritime College. Hi, Barbara.
Nice to see you. Thank
To the panel, I read today that Iran is suing the United States in the International Court of Justice regarding these sanctions. And the basis of their jurisdiction is, unbelievably, the 1955 Treaty of Amity between Iran and the United States. Before we all laugh out loud, what do you think about this? And my impression is, from my understanding of the ICJ, that that's not a proper basis for jurisdiction in the ICJ, which can't compel anybody to come before it. What do you think about it?
We were talking about this earlier. I mean, I think it's wonderful the way Iran is using these international institutions now. And there's actually apparently looks like FATF rules are going to go through the Iranian parliament finally. So, I mean, that's kind of a silver lining. But on a practical level, I don't think...
It's a PR, it's not
PR,
policy, it's not politics, it's PR.
Interesting. Okay. I see another hand behind right there. Yeah.
Hi, Elliot Ruvelson, U.S. UAE Business Council. I wanted to ask you, and this is for the panel in general, about Turkey, which you had mentioned very briefly. I wanted to know if the sanctions the sanction package will have any effect on Iranian natural gas exports to Turkey, pipeline exports. And also I wanted to ask, post Reza Zareb trial, Halkbank conviction, where are we in terms of big financial institutions being able or thinking that they can evade or help cheat sanctions, Halkbank and the other Turkish banks that have been convicted of sanctions evasion, it's my understanding, have not been fined yet. So is is a lack of fines kind of signal that yes, in fact, the costs are relatively low for cheating?
Actually, Robin, did you hear that question about Turkey? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, and also maybe Sarah. I mean, President Trump seems to like President Erdogan a great deal, and I don't know how that will factor in as well. But if you have any thoughts on that, Turkey, natural gas to Turkey.
Yes. Yeah, sure. I think specifically on natural gas, very, very difficult for the Iranians or for the Turks to cut off the natural gas supplies from Iran. They go to southwest Turkey, which is very cold in winter. There's no other easy source of supply in that part of the country. So, if they don't get the gas, people die. I don't think any government can accept that. And the Turks have obviously taken a pretty determined line that they're going to do their best not to comply with sanctions this time. They're actually paying for the gas is something else, and you remember the famous gold for gas trade of the Obama era sanctions. So how do the Turks actually manage to pay for this gas, or whether it just accumulates unpaid bills that are to be settled off at some point I think is another thing. But certainly they'll continue taking the gas as much as possible. I think I don't really feel qualified to answer the banking question, but I think in general Turkey has made it clear that not only the gas, but it will take as much oil as possible. It's more the payment mechanisms that are the issue.
Sarah, do you have anything to add on Turkey or?
Amos could give his final word on this, that while during the previous sanctions they never targeted Iran's natural gas export. One reason for what Robin did, but on the other side is that Iran is not really making so much money out of that. It's kind of stuck in that contract. And putting sanctions on Iran export to Turkey would be a gift to Iranian, and they would avoid all these trials that Turkey won, and it went into the favor of Turkey because Iran has that long-term commitment to Turkey, but especially on the peak demand season in winter, Iran cannot fully supply to its commitment. Also, the prices that are negotiated are very low, and Turkish officials are arguing that they're high in compared to other prices. So there was always lots of court and claims against Iranian that the prices are high. So I think that there were good enough reasons not to put on U.S. perspective, not to put Iran's gas under sanctions. But
is there anything else you guys can say about Halkbank or any of what went on during that period?
Part of the problem when you get beyond the first layer of the policy, right, and we can all talk about the 30,000 foot on oil sanctions, you start getting into real infrastructure questions, you start getting into tough questions that you have to actually understand. So for instance, somebody said in the press, well, no, it'll be fine because Turkey's building Turk Stream with Russia and they're going to have more gas from the Blue Stream. But there you have to actually know what you're talking about, right? Because as Robin said, Turkey has a pipeline system that is not integrated. So parts of the country receive gas that don't have actual alternatives. So you can flood southern Turkey, Istanbul, with a lot of gas from Russia, but it can't get to the areas where the Iranians are supplying gas. And then you actually have to know what Sarah just said, which is that they've been in disputes between Iran and Turkey every winter because if it snows in Tehran, there are difficulties in the pipes from Iran, and Turkey doesn't get any gas. So there are a lot of complications here, and I think that we made the determination not to target gas, but it was part of a negotiation with Turkey where we saw that we were trying to do two things: cut off as much revenue to Iran as possible, as quickly as possible, and not hurt our friends and allies. And you had to make judgments, and condensate is in that category that we agonized over how to deal with condensate. Because if I starve some of my friends and allies and cause them significant increase in price, then that would be a problem. So Dubai, for instance, was having a tremendous problem with backfilling condensate from Iran, and we, the United States, were going around the world trying to find condensate for Dubai. These were the kinds of conversations we were having in those days. So at some point, the administration is going to have, that's what I said before, on policy-wise, the more success, if you want zero, right, if you want Iran to hurt a lot, the more successful you are at that, the more complications you have at home. With higher prices, and the more complications you have with your allies of pushing them into recession. right? The oil price drop in 2014 was the biggest tax cut the world has ever seen because they had oil lower for longer than we've ever seen, and therefore countries like India and others had this huge tax cut all of a sudden. So now, if you're going to be successful at going to close to zero, you will be driving certain countries into recession, because the closer you are to zero, the higher the price will go. If you're not very successful, you're only moderately successful, meaning you take 1 million, 1.5 million off the market, but Iran is still exporting about 800,000, then you can keep an equilibrium of price. Because that, I still think that even in the medium term, the world can supply itself, even with the grade issue that Robin talked about, we can still supply the market with that. But then Iran has no incentive to come back to the negotiating table, so you lost on that end. So you're starting to say that the administration went in certain parallel streams of what it wants, and we're now, not right now, but in about 6 months from now, 8 months from now, those will start clashing. And we're not there yet, but they will, they have to. Because you can't go to zero exports for a period of time that is longer than a year without radical implications on the market. But if you stay at the 800,000, you can, but you don't have success on your Iran policy.
I think, just on top of that, with the banking question, don't assume that Hulk is still getting off and that this stuff is going to be tolerated. I think you have the Department of Justice, which investigates things independently. I think the Deputy Attorney General's made that pretty clear. And then you also have the Department of Financial Services in New York, which is the one actually doing a lot of the enforcement through New York City, right? So they have a completely independent charter from the federal government, and they are often tougher than others. One quick point, too, on what Amos was saying. When this administration, right, comes up with this idea that they're going to get to 110% or 120%, whatever it is, of where we were in 2013, the first thing they're going to do is draw up an options paper, and they're going to ask the people, well, what are we going to get from these options? And the folks who are in the government are going to know, look, we're going to struggle with China, we're going to struggle with India, and we're definitely going to be struggling with Turkey now in a way that we weren't back in 2013. The whole relationship around Turkey, especially with the Russia sanctions, that could be actually applying to Turkey soon for the purchase of the S-400 system from Moscow. So the whole relationship with Turkey has deteriorated, regardless of whether the president is fist bumping Erdogan at a G20 meeting or not. That relationship is going to be there, and they're going to say, look, we're going to see some bleed off of the effectiveness here. So what else can we put on the table? Right, so they're going to be looking at other options, and I wouldn't be stunned if something like condensate was actually subject to sanctions this time around, or the natural gas. I mean, they're going to have to, if they're really serious about getting to greater than it was in 2013, they're going to have to put other things on the table to get there. So that's just something to kind of look out for, because all of these other issues are going to come into play. But if we're already fighting with Turkey about a whole host of other things, who cares if we throw natural gas in? I mean, that's how some of these calculations may end up working out.
Anna, I want to ask you about the banking question, whether Russia's already under sanctions. It has nothing to lose, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Will it be able to work with Iran on financial issues, banking issues? Can the two of them together manage some deals, perhaps, that will help Iran evade sanctions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Look, one thing that one reason why Russia, one of the many reasons why Russia turned east was because Russia itself was isolated because of sanctions. And Iran, for its part, provided an opportunity where there was less competition from Western businesses. So it was simply easier for Russia to find a niche. And I think that's certainly a possibility. I don't have any details on how that might play out, but I don't.
Well, you mentioned this economic zone and so on.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I think that relationship is fraught with a lot of problems, but it doesn't mean that they're not trying to overcome them. I mean, the very fact of the matter is, the very fact that Russia has offered this trade area to Iran, that in and of itself is important, and these discussions are going to keep going. And what's also interesting in the Russia-Iran trade relationship is that it benefits, probably benefits Russia more than it benefits Iran. just because by the virtue of Iranian goods are not always as high quality and so forth. And because primarily from the foreign policy perspective, Russia views us as the adversary. It did, and it's going to continue to do so. I think we should have no questions about that. It's going to look for ways to undermine us wherever it can.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. I see all the way, kind of 2/3 of the way back, young man there, right there, and then someone next to him. So we'll take those. Why don't we take those two together? Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is Jahan, a student of political science from Afghanistan. My question is about the effects of these sanctions on Iran's neighboring countries, smaller like Afghanistan. We import 30% of our consumed gas and oil from Iran. So I was wondering that will there be any exemption to a country like that, since Afghanistan is a partner to the United States and there is a fight against terrorism going on there? So I wanted to hear from the panelists about that.
Very good. And there was another hand that went up right there behind there. Yeah. Why don't we take that question as well?
Yeah, Ken Meyergord. Was Iran's threat to close the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, if they aren't able to sell their oil, motivated by a fear that we would be successful in getting people to comply with the sanctions? Or was there some suggestion on our part that if we weren't that successful, we might stop Iranian shipments to non-compliant destinations?
Okay. On the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, my sense is that that's a rather idle threat because it would hurt Iran more than, or as much or more than anyone else. But there have been some drone strikes by the Houthis on Saudi oil installations, very minor, almost nuisance events. But I mean, one could imagine a situation where the Iranians use their proxies to attack the oil infrastructure of their adversaries in the region. So let me throw that out there, as well as the question about Afghanistan. I would assume that we would not try to block Iran from selling energy to Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are the trade-offs that you end up running into. I think Afghanistan does often get kind of a pass in some of these because of OEF, but Operation Enduring Freedom. But yeah, I mean, some of these are the exemptions that are going to be made. It's hard to say with any certainty what's going to come. I mean, again, there's always that chance that the guy at the top doesn't like the optics of something, and that isn't always necessarily based in kind of the rational thought of everybody below him. So that would be a broader concern that I think most people should just keep in the back of their head as a wild card here.
Yeah. What about attacks on the installations, do you think?
First of all, I actually don't share your view that it's an idle threat. In other words,
really?
Look, again, I go back to my previous question. Are you going to be successful at these sanctions or not? And what is success? If success is going to zero or close to zero, right? 100, 150,000 barrels a day only, or let's say the 200,000 that they have with certain Chinese buyers. The more you push someone to the wall, they're not a passive. We keep talking about it like Iran is a passive player in this international chess game of Iranian oil. They're not a passive player. So at some point, you don't have to close the Strait of Hormuz permanently. You don't have to do very much, in fact. All you have to do is show some intent that you are willing to do it and take one action or two actions in the straits. Because remember what I said at the beginning, oil traders they're very reactive to headlines. The risk premium on oil from Iran has risen a little bit, but not much. Because people haven't yet seen that the market can or can't be delivered. The reason we had a rise up to $79 and then kind of a slip back is partly because people calmed down a little bit and thought, all right, the Chinese are probably not going to cut their imports all that much, and there's going to be enough oil in the market from Iran and from others to cover, so we'll be okay. But the minute you start putting in risk premiums, that price starts going up in a way that is very difficult to measure. When ISIS storms Mosul and goes down, compare your headlines on Mosul and oil prices.
Sure.
Now, Iraq doesn't produce very much oil outside of Kirkuk till the south. Nobody thought they were going down to the south that day, but nervousness in the market creates significant measures in oil. So I don't see it as an idle threat. I think it's part of, guys, we can talk up the price of oil and create some damage here. We're not going to be the only ones to suffer. And as far as neighbors, look, Afghanistan is a special story, but we were pretty tough on Pakistan as a neighbor that was having hardships on gas. We had some accommodations here and there, but they could decide to be pretty tough.
Sarah, you're Iranian. What do you think? Are these idle threats, or could they actually follow through on some of this?
Yeah, I'm not in the mind of the leaders when they say this. But no, I agree. So as I also mentioned earlier, Iran is kind of reminding the market and also playing psychological play game with the traders, that if the market is going to use all the spare capacity for covering for me, imagine if there is an interruption somewhere. Strait of Hormuz, not immediately or at all, because Iran's import of grain or everything comes through that. So closure of Strait of Hormuz, not, yes, I mean, Iran, I don't say Iran would do that, but if something happens somewhere and like 500,000 barrels is off the market, 1 million is off the market, who is going to comply with the U.S. sanctions? Because we are talking about the OPEC spare capacity, just in the recent studies come out, is 2.6 million barrels per day. Almost 1.9 is from Saudi Arabia. So all of Iran's oil export would cover with 70% of the world's spare capacity. And the question when we are talking about the expiration date of the sanctions is not only compliance with the sanctions, our countries, is the market too. Traders are ready to comply, but they're so worried about the spare capacity. And their worry was at the time that President Trump just questioned or asked for significant reduction, and everybody was talking about that 20% cut, 1 million barrels, but now we are talking about to zero. Even if we are not looking at the zero as a number, we are saying 2 million barrels cut off from the market. So having 2 million barrels covering for Iran, having Venezuela and Libya, as Robin said, this is really a scary moment for a market to have not so much buffer point. And this is a question for how long the traders and the importers are going to feel comfortable. The other thing is that for how long Saudi Arabia is willing to release a spare capacity. Spare capacity's cost is different from normal oil production cost. So for how long Saudi Arabia is willing to produce and put that cost on the table. I mean, of course, Saudi Arabia would benefit from Iran's regime change, or Iran agreeing with 10 commands or 12 conditions of U.S. Government. But would Iran agree? So if we have like going endlessly, as Amos said, the policy should have a end date.
Let me ask a really stupid question. Oil contracts are typically for what, a year in advance, 6 months in advance? How are they usually done?
So we have two different types. We have like term contracts, which are for a year, could be negotiated every 6 months, and we have a spot that you can sell. I mean, we have Iranian having lots of term contracts with Japanese, but even in 2017, they didn't purchase all of that. So there's lots of negotiation back and forth. But talking about spare capacity is that even Saudi Arabia, that is kind of backbone of these sanctions and is the major producer that can cover for Iran, for how long would like to do.
And they want to diversify. They don't want to simply focus on their oil production.
Yeah, and during 2012, when they covered for Iran, their production was less than now. So they were not going to produce maximum, like full effort, full grade covering for Iran.
Okay. Okay. Sina, let me take three. Take Sina, this gentleman here, and this lady here. We'll take all three together, and then let me do it first. So, yeah, we'll start. Okay.
Thank you. So, the question is for Sarah. I'm not sure if you read the news, but the Iranians are saying that we've prepared packages, we are ready. I mean, some of it, it's propaganda, but how do you think Iranians will prepare themselves? And do you think this time around will be different from the 2012? I mean, the administration is different. Rouhani and his foreign policy is different from Ahmadinejad and his foreign policy team. So do you think there will be any difference this time around? Thanks.
In terms of the oil policy or?
The preparing for the sanctions. They've said, we have packages ready to defeat the sanctions.
Okay.
That's what they say.
Hand the mic to the young man behind you there. Yeah.
Vince Alvaso. I'm pretty surprised that I haven't heard much about China. China is Iran's largest trader. gets a lot of oil from Iran, biggest oil export from Iran, through what we were talking about earlier, the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran's also a central part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, where we're having railroads and seaport terminals in Bandar Abbas, for example. And last week, China also hosted the China Arab States Forum. And it seems like China's also, along with Russia, they're also getting along with all the states in the regions, with Saudi Arabia and UAE and all that. But it seems like China will also be probably the biggest obstacle with
Right, we've talked about that a little bit, but
sanctions.
we can talk about
So how
it
they
some
can
more.
get around that?
And if you can pass it to this lady here.
Hi, Emily Meredith with Energy Intelligence, and I just wanted, you all talked a little bit about cheating before, and the last time we saw this happen, we saw like changing papers of origin for the oil, we saw ship-to-ship transfers out at sea, a lot of that was off the coast of the UAE and Oman. How do you see that happening this time? Is it easier or harder to rein that behavior in today than it was at that point?
Okay, maybe, Sarah, we'll start with you and then we'll pass it around to everybody else.
Well, on cheating, I think would be obviously harder, having Reza Zarrab revealing all the channels and everything that happened. But I think the surveillance technology is pretty clear. But this time I came up with this is what Iranian media are very good to blowing off their strategies. There was a high topic of one of these media that this is how our Iranian government is going to circumvent the sanctions. So basically they were describing that they're going to use the share fields that so the other side would produce it, and I don't know how technically it would be doable or like how much is going to be.
Which shared fields?
Like there are shared fields with Iraq, for instance. So Iraq could produce, because it's oil fields are not quite like gas fields that you can produce from the other side and get commission. But this was like studies, so through the joint agreement, and they're looking into that. And that was according to that. We were like looking to see how much that could add to their export. But as you said, ship to ship is something that they were doing since the war, and they could do that, change the origins of the ship, names of the ships. Amos could give more opinion on that how they could recognize this or how much could happen. As far as the packages, some things have been changed since last time. So the moment JCPOA and agreement happened with P5+1, Iran's leader talked about economy resistance. So he kind of anticipated a time of like something happened. So now they're processing more condensate inside. If the condensate is targeted, the export of condensate, they are processing it more inside. They are producing more gasoline, so they can export more like final products. They're producing electricity from gas more than before, so they can expand their export. But honestly, I can't find so many packages. Obviously, the economic situation would be harder. The currency would be devaluated. They cannot have access to gold for their barrels of oil, not to the cash.
Will they put oil on tankers and just sort of float it around as they did last time as well?
But you can see that. You can track that. You can see their storages. It's very easy. You can see if this storage yesterday was full and today is empty. You can see the tankers are moving. So everything is like, you can look at it, unless like somehow you blend in one tanker like crude oil with fuel oil and then say this is like, I don't know, diesel or fuel oil is exported, but is actually exporting crude oil. But again, that's not a significant number.
Yeah.
But
Robin, do you have any thoughts on cheating and smuggling? I hadn't thought that so many of the people who were expert at the smuggling were driven out by Rouhani, and I don't know if they can be re-recruited to do what they did before, or some of them are sitting in Evan prison or in Canada. Any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I guess I kind of shy away from calling it cheating, because cheating implies that both sides agree to the rules of the game, right? It's really sanctions avoidance from the Iranian point of view.
Yeah. And we should remember who violated the JCPOA. Yeah.
How do the Iranians get around it? I think we talked about most of the methods, and I think I agree with the discussion earlier. The efficacy of these is limited. 150, 200,000 barrels a day. hard to hide a lot more than that, I think.
Okay. Any other thoughts about China? I think we talked about China. We suggested that Iran's oil exports would be thrown on the table with all the other disputes we have with China over trade. And unfortunately for Iran, if the Chinese can strike a deal with us on other trade issues, perhaps they'll cut back on Iranian oil, or will the Belt Road take precedence? I mean, China has a fairly ambitious view of its role in the region, certainly, and has had good relations with Iran for a very long time. It's been its major trading partner for a very long time now, since the last bout of sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting if you look at China is last time this went down, they effectively cabined all their trade with Iran within Kunlun Bank, right? So something that was entirely separated from the U.S. economy. We talked about Europe being entirely dollarized in a lot of ways and so dependent on the U.S., especially New York City, but China doesn't have that issue necessarily, and so I wouldn't be stunned. In fact, I'd be shocked to not see that happen again. Now, whether that gets folded in with a bigger trade deal, I think is anybody's guess.
Was Kunlun Bank fined in the end, or
so it was sanctioned? It was
sanctioned, which means it can't.
It can't deal with the U.S.
Yeah, but so
it wasn't doing it anyway.
It wasn't doing it anyway, right?
And that's that's the price that certain
as much PR as
yeah. I mean, it has a big effect, right? Because we talked about, I spoke about kind of how prevalent the dollar is, but that's not true everywhere. And so Russia might be willing to do the same thing, especially given status of sanctions on Russia. And so, I think you would see that again. In terms of cheating, I think the other thing too is we've gotten better at the ship-to-ship stuff. You've seen some sanctions come down with respect to ship-to-ship transfers for Libyan oil smuggling in recent months, and the other big thing, too, that's been kind of mentioned is the insurance sector. So the insurance sector in 2012, 2013 was a little bit behind the game on all of this and is much more aware of this now, especially after OFAC issued the North Korea shipping advisory, I guess, earlier this year. And so people are much more aware of that. And, if you're one of these countries and you're conducting a ship-to-ship transfer, if you all of a sudden lose your insurance on that ship, that's worth how many hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a pretty scary proposition, right? And so that raises the risk of your dealings pretty substantially, which I think helps drive it down.
But a cautionary note on that is the sanction avoidance mechanisms that they will do. The ones that we know of are always the ones that you've done before, right? So we walked in 2012, not assuming that they're going to do exactly what Saddam did in the last big operation of sanction avoidance. So to assume that, to say, here's what happened 2012 through 2015, and therefore these are the options they have and they're not as good anymore. It's right, the better your car alarm is, now the thief has to figure out how to get by the car alarm. So you're in that game, so there's new mechanisms. There are other mechanisms to blend oil, there are other things they can do. Some we can use our imaginations in getting at, and some we will figure out. Part of the problem with ship-to-ship, for instance, is you always know about it after it already happened. It's not something you can stop. You can only punish those that you can, and sometimes you can't even punish the ones involved. You don't know who they are, and these ships belong to all kinds of jurisdictions that are strange places. So there are all kinds of things that can happen on a product. I think it's important to remember two things. There will be circumvention of sanctions, and that's a certainty, and it will not be a very large volume. So, yes, it will happen, but how much effort you put into it is sort of input-output, right?
Okay. Also, the shipping fleet. Now, Iranian tanker company has much more ships, so they might not be worried so much about tankers, like insurance on their own, because that's what they transfer lots of oil without insurance during the previous sanctions. So now they have much more large VLCCs.
Okay. Well, I think we've come to the end. One last question over here. We'll grab. I didn't see you. Could you wait for the microphone, please? Okay, and say your name.
Yes. My name is Priscilla Hart, and I wanted to go a little bit off the beaten track here. Very appropriately, this has dealt with current geopolitics of oil. And obviously everyone is very concerned about Iran and about geopolitics elsewhere regarding oil. So my question is, if we look 20 or 50 years ahead, does Iran have any energy technologists today who are looking at alternative energy?
Funny you should mention that. We just ran an item on our Iran Source blog, by the way, for those of you who are interested, on that very question. And they have started looking into renewables, but rather late in the game. And unfortunately, because of the resumption of sanctions, some of the foreign companies that had struck deals with Iran for solar and so on are pulling out. I think, as a major oil producer and gas producer, Iran came a little late to the game, but certainly has been thinking about it.
Very initial studies, but it has always been costly and lots of other priorities to use their money because they were never in a normal economic situation. Or, I mean, this same as many other neighboring countries, but now we have UAE or Saudi Arabia that they're really much more working on this and investing on renewable projects than Iran.
Are Iranian public policy people sitting around tables and saying, gee, in 50 years we may not
I don't know that Iranians are thinking 50 years ahead. I think they're thinking day to day right now.
That's really not an Iran question. That is countries that make money off of a significant amount of their budgets are based on hydrocarbon exports. What do they think about diversifying their economies? I think they all think about it, but these are very difficult issues that take very many years to diversify economies away from something that's worked so well.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end. I want to thank the speakers. They're all terrific, and I want to thank you all very much for coming. And please do follow our blog, Iran Source, Atlantic Council Iran Source, and you'll find many of these topics covered there. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.